What's up, heathens? How y'all doing? I'm the Godless engineer, and I critically analyze apologist claims to give you the best arguments and information so that you can stand up and use your voice. Today, we're going to be looking at a somewhat old video from ThinkEasy, and he's going to provide us with 5 undeniable sources that prove that the historical Jesus really existed. Let's see what he's got for us.
Source number 4, the Babylonian Talmud. The Talmud, Hebrew for study, is one of the central works of the Jewish people. It is the record of rabbinic teachings that spans a period of about 600 years. Yet another source that has nothing to do with Christianity. This comes from the Jewish people, and they are simply recording the facts.
What? Why would you even cite the Talmud here? Oh my god. I take it back. Tacitus is not the worst evidence that you could use. Actually, this is the worst evidence that you could use. The Jesus that's in the Talmud existed 100 years prior to the Jesus that was supposedly represented by the Gospels or any of the New Testament. I mean, this guy wasn't even born in the right era. Why would you use it? Anyways, let's see what this guy's other proofs of the historical Jesus that he has. I'm up to being persuaded away from my mythicism, but can this guy actually persuade me? Let's find out.
Hey guys, I'm Eric from ThinkEasy. So I get the claim a lot that Jesus never existed. Typically, I see this objection brought up when atheists are in an argument that they're having trouble with. And so when they're having trouble answering the other objections, this serves as their proverbial trump card.
Well, no, if there are any atheists out there that are using the mythicist position as their trump card for any argument you might be having over whether Jesus is a deity, Jesus is the son of God, or that the biblical version of Jesus existed, then I really think that you should find different arguments, or you should really read up on the other arguments that definitely disprove all of that. The mythicism position is a very specific niche to be getting into, and only if you're talking about the minimal historical Jesus do you really want to be diving into these very advanced concepts of history concerning the historical Jesus. So definitely don't use this as a trump card. If anybody out there is, just stop.
Well, Jesus never existed anyway, or don't you know that the Jesus story was borrowed from pagan mythology?
Also, don't say that Jesus' story was borrowed from pagan mythology. Pagan mythology did have an effect on the ideas in Christianity. That's very obvious when you consider the virgin birth narrative. That has pagan written all over it, because prior to that, the pagans were already used to gods coming down, impregnating human mortals, and producing these demigod figures, which is pretty much describing Jesus at that point. So I wouldn't say that, the Christians or the Jewish Christians copied off of these pagans, but they did work in some of the ideas that pagans already had into their religion. That includes Paul with his celestial Jesus as well. Most notably Osiris. If you had to make a comparison between the mystery cult that was the Jewish Christians of Paul, who were the first Christians, by the way, I would definitely compare them to the Isis and Osiris cult, not any of these other figures. Just don't even worry about that. Just go directly to Isis and Osiris.
Oh, and by the way, there are no credible historians that mention Jesus. Well, let's examine those claims together and give you something to think about. Here are my top 5 non-Christian sources attesting to the historical Jesus.
Oh boy, I am ready. Come on, Eric, let's do it.
And before we go into the 5 sources, let me explain something about the nature of ancient history. When dealing with this subject, we need to keep in mind that this is the ancient world. They didn't have copy machines. They didn't have typewriters. They didn't have fax machines or computers. Not only that, but they had trouble keeping the material they had serviceable. There are many ancient documents that have been lost to wars, to water, fire, the bugs, and countless other elements.
This is a very good point to make, except probably not for the reasons that he's thinking about. You have to consider these things because Christians were in control of their own documents. Like the early documents that would have proved whether or not Paul actually believed in an earthly Jesus, the documents from outside sources that would have mentioned Jesus have inexplicably gone missing. They've been lost to time or they've been directly destroyed. This is a very important point, but it's not the point that this guy wants to make. He's also trying to frame how we do ancient history, especially in the first century, as being something that we just don't know a lot about, which is true. But at the same time, when you compare Jesus to other historical figures that made really big waves in the community, you would see how different the evidence for Jesus is compared to them. The evidence for Jesus is actually very, very minimal, if existing at all.
So this modern standard that we need to have absolutely perfect and unquestionable sources before we accept a historical claim is just incorrect, and it's not the way ancient history is done.
Well, what you're talking about is the ideal evidence for something happening in history and what we actually have. So the ideal evidence would be a completely trustworthy source that reports exactly what happened. That's the ideal source for historians. We don't always get that, so we just have to take what we have and do the best that we can with what's available to us. And I think that's what he's kind of getting at here, but he's trying to frame it in a way that, makes ancient history sound a lot more dubious than it is.
Not only this, but if something was not considered newsworthy, then Roman historians wouldn't record it. They mostly recorded things of economic or political nature. So an unheard of rabbi teaching in the smallest pocket of the Middle East, needless to say, is not very newsworthy.
Well, I mean, that kind of depends on how you're talking about it here, because we have Josephus, who did write about other failed messiahs like the Egyptian, that was going around at the time. He would have just been another end times preaching rabbi that was trying to fulfill messianic prophecy. You would think that Josephus would notice somebody that was going around doing the exact same thing and write about him, at least enough to get a following that would have survived after he died. You're trying to make it out to be like Jesus was just somebody that was there, nobody took notice of. But that's really contradictory to the story of Christianity, what you think about as Christianity, because he was apparently popular enough to gain a massive following, enough to have his religion survive after he died, but it's also not big enough to be noticed. Those concepts seem to be at odds with each other.
So the fact that Jesus is mentioned in secular history is itself huge. So I'll go on record and say that we don't necessarily need any secular history in order to prove the historicity of Jesus.
Yes, you need secular history. The Gospels don't get you anywhere. Paul, he doesn't directly get you to an earthly Jesus. He doesn't talk about meeting anybody that knew Jesus. He doesn't talk about Jesus actually walking on earth. Despite what many apologists say, he doesn't even talk about Jesus being born here on earth. He talks about Jesus being made. That's clearly present in his writings. So I don't know why you're thinking that we should accept biased and obviously magical writings from people that are lifetimes later than when Jesus supposedly lived on the earth. This is not how you do history.
The multiple letters that we have penned down by Paul and the apostles, collected in what we call the New Testament, is itself enough. And in fact, secular historians would agree with that.
Well, I don't agree with that. Paul, maybe. The other, the Gospels and other writings are not good evidence. They're not evidence because they're all dependent upon Paul. The only evidence that you have within Christianity is Paul.
Not to mention the countless number of Christian writers down through the ages who wrote about Jesus.
Well, we don't care about the countless number of Christian writers through the ages. We care about people that were contemporary to Jesus at the time and their writings about Jesus. It doesn't have to be directly right on top of Jesus, but you would think they would have written about him just a few years later or something like that. But that's not what we find.
But for the sake of argument, let's go ahead and see if Jesus is mentioned in secular history. Source number 1, Tacitus. Tacitus was a Roman orator and public official, probably the greatest historian and one of the greatest prose stylists who wrote in the Latin language. So here we have a serious Roman historian who is not sympathetic to Christianity and is merely recording the facts. He wrote a work called the Annals, which was dealing with the Roman Empire from dates AD 14 to AD 68.
Not Tacitus. Jesus Christ. Tacitus is not good evidence that Jesus existed in history. Let's forego the discussion over whether or not Tacitus actually wrote the highly Christian portions of his passage. That's a highly nuanced position, and I get that a lot of people have problems with it. But if you just take that particular passage at face value, it's more likely that Tacitus was referring to Christus and his Christians, rather than Christ and his Christians. But regardless of that point, let's just focus on it being about Christians. Well, that just says that Christians were blamed for the burning of Rome in 64 CE. That doesn't actually get us to like 30. That doesn't tell us anything about Jesus, the person. That just tells us that his followers were assholes in Rome. That's it. So right off the bat here, you could totally just throw out Tacitus, because even Robert Van Voorst, who's a Christian apologist, he's written extensively on the outside sources for Jesus. He doesn't even consider Tacitus to be a good source for the historical Jesus. So you just need to throw this point out. Okay, just toss it.
From this source, we learn two things. That Christ is the one from whom the Christians got their name from, and that Christ suffered under the Roman procurator, Pontius Pilate.
So, you're trying to tell me that the information that we get from Tacitus is the same information that we would get from the Gospels. Now, what you didn't highlight here is that Tacitus was writing in the 2nd century. So even if he wrote that particular portion of Annals, he would have ultimately gotten his information from Christians or the Gospels in general. Now, you may be asking, where would he have gotten this information about Christians that ultimately stems from the Gospels? Well, that would be Pliny the Younger. He was interrogating Christians in the next province, and he was a regular pen pal of Tacitus. So the information that you just listed is basically information that you get from the Gospel, which is the ultimate source of the information that Tacitus would have pulled his information from. So you've really just given us the Gospels as evidence. I thought these were supposed to be outside sources. All you have in this source is just somebody using the Gospels to relay the Gospel message. What's your next fucking source?
Source number 2, Pliny the Younger. Pliny the Younger was a Roman author and administrator who left a collection of private letters of great literary charm, intimately illustrating public and private life in the heyday of the Roman Empire.
Oh, god damn it. No, oh, no. Okay. Pliny the Younger wrote about interrogating Christians about what they believe. He is not a citation for a historical Jesus. He was also writing in the 2nd century, just like Tacitus. So he is not evidence that a historical Jesus existed. I mean, he's evidence that Christians by the 2nd century had adopted the gospel message that we can find in the gospels that we know now. That's it. That's all that we got. So can we just fast forward through the whole Pliny thing? If you're really interested in this guy just regurgitating all these sources, I got him linked down below, but let's just get to what he thinks that we can glean from the source of Pliny the Younger.
We learn a few things about early Christian life from this source, but most importantly, we learn that Christ was sung to or worshipped as a god.
So wait, that's all that we know from Pliny? How is this evidence for Jesus? I mean, yeah, you're talking about the actions or the traditions of Christians that were already established in the 2nd century. I don't see how this gets us to a historical Jesus. Is this going to be the quality of your evidence throughout the entire thing? Just bullshit after bullshit? God, I hope not. Okay, what is your next piece of evidence? We're on number 3. So far, you've had nothing but shit. Let's see what you got.
Source number 3, Josephus. Josephus was a Jewish priest, scholar, and historian who wrote valuable works on the Jewish revolt of 66 to 70 AD and on earlier Jewish history. Josephus is another historian non-sympathetic to Christianity.
Oh. God. Josephus. This particular source is a bigger pain in my side than Tacitus is, to be quite honest. So basically, I mean, he's going to go through the Testimonium Flavianum. He's going to say that there's an earlier redaction of it, but that's not really true. Alice Wheatley definitely disproved an earlier version of the Testimonium Flavianum. Paul Hopper has shown that the text, the structure of it, and the word usage and everything is not indicative of Josephus and how he writes. There's a lot of different things that go into the Josephine Testimonium Flavianum. So, I mean, I'm not going to go through all that here because I've went through it extensively in the past, but the Testimonium Flavianum is a whole insertion there, and this is becoming a more popular opinion in the field. Of course, you're going to have Christian apologists and some New Testament scholars who are going to fight tooth and nail that this is authentic, but it just simply is not, and none of them have actually responded to the academic arguments that have been put forth in various journals.
So from this source alone, we learn 5 things. Jesus was considered to be wise, good, and virtuous. Jesus was the teacher. Jesus was crucified under Pontius Pilate. Jesus' followers reported that he had risen from the dead, and he was also considered to be the Messiah that the Old Testament prophets spoke about.
Again, how is this any kind of historical information about Jesus existing? This is all information that you could get from the gospel, but also with the Josephus passage, obviously it's a whole insertion, not just a partial interpolation or anything like that. It's a whole insertion. That particular passage really doesn't seem to need to be there because it interrupts the flow from the previous passage. The passage that occurs after the Testimonium Flavianum seems to reference the passage before the Testimonium Flavianum. And the other things that we have covered on this being that the structure and verb usage and everything about the Testimonium Flavianum does not match Josephus's work, and the fact that it does not exist in any other form prior to Eusebius, it would seem to indicate that it's strongly plausible that it was wholly inserted. So yet again, you're telling me the things that we can learn from Josephus are the exact things that we could learn from the Gospels. It kind of seems like this information comes from the Gospels, not from any kind of contemporary account of Jesus. Okay, I'm scared. I'm legitimately afraid to ask what your next piece of evidence is. But go ahead. What's your next piece of evidence?
Source number 4, the Babylonian Talmud. The Talmud, Hebrew for study, is one of the central works of the Jewish people. It is the record of rabbinic teachings that spans a period of about 600 years. Yet another source that has nothing to do with Christianity. This comes from the Jewish people, and they are simply recording the facts.
I don't have more hands. Okay, so the big issue with the Talmud. There is a Jesus mentioned in it. There's also 2 messiahs that are mentioned in it later, but what he's going to be talking about here is the Jesus that's mentioned that was captured, he was tried, he was killed, and he was accused of doing magical things. But the problem is that this particular Jesus of Nazareth actually lived between 104 and 78 BCE under King Jannaeus. Craig Evans, Graham Twelftree, and Peter Schaeffer are all New Testament scholars that have examined this particular piece of evidence and have come to the conclusion that this particular Jesus of Nazareth actually lived under King Jannaeus. The relevant section here is Sanhedrin 43a. But another big problem is that this particular Jesus is in no way referenced in the same way as the Jesus of Christianity. For one thing, he was executed for sorcery, not blasphemy. In this one, he's executed by the Jews, not the Romans. And he was stoned, not crucified. And a big one is that he was killed in Lydda, not Jerusalem. This particular Yeshua was connected to the government and did have 5 disciples, but they were all immediately killed after his death. This entire narrative in the Talmud is directly contradictory to the gospel. So again, I ask, why would you even bring this up if this is not even the same Jesus that supposedly started the Christian religion? He's so far removed that it's a wonder you think this proves your case.
From this source we learn 2 things, that Jesus was hanged on the eve of Passover and that he was accused of sorcery, or in other words, miraculous works.
Okay, but you're completely ignoring that the reason why Jesus is crucified in the New Testament is because he was committing blasphemy, not because he was healing people or doing his miraculous works. Those were not the reasons why he was killed by the Jews. I'm still amazed that you think that this supports your point of a historical Jesus. This is very clearly a reference to the Jews practicing what we would understand as crucifixion, though. The execution method was stoning, and then his dead corpse was hung up on display. That is what the passage is talking about. So this is in direct accordance with the idea of crucifixion. So you agree that the Jews were crucifying people too. Good to know. I know I'm going to regret this. What's your next piece of evidence?
Source number 5, Lucian. Lucian was a Greek writer, rhetorician, pamphleteer, and satirist.
Oh, no. Lucian is so far removed from the time of Jesus that he can literally only relay what Christians were commonly thinking in the 2nd century. He had one mention of Christians in the death of Peregrinus written in 165 AD. This is so far outside of the possible time frame for somebody to be contemporaneously writing about Jesus. But there's still the fact that he could be referencing somebody that did witness Jesus and is only like citing them as information. But that's actually not what he does in it. So it's not necessarily the time frame that's the problem. It's the fact that he's just relaying what common Christians thought in the 2nd century. And if you need a New Testament scholar to really hang your hat on for Lucian not being evidence of Jesus, then look to Robert Van Voorst in his Jesus Outside the New Testament, which I've referenced earlier in this video. He doesn't think that Lucian could relay any kind of useful information about the historical Jesus, so he really shouldn't be used as evidence for the historical Jesus.
We certainly learn a lot of things about Christians in this passage, but most importantly, we learn 2 things about Jesus: that he was crucified and that he was worshipped as a god.
So again, you're telling me that the Christians of this mid-2nd century were relaying common information that they got from their Gospels and their religion in general. How is this proof that Jesus existed, or that he even died or was crucified? I really don't understand this connection here, because he's just relaying what Christians already thought in the 2nd century. I can't get past that point. In reality, you can't get past that point because they're not first-hand accounts. So Lucian is not evidence for Jesus existing in history. And the prime reason is because he's only regurgitating what common Christians thought about Jesus at this time in the 2nd century. Oh God, is that 5? I think that was 5. I'm so ready for this to be over, but there's still like 2 minutes left. What the fuck else does he have to say?
So here's the deal. Each one of these sources alone is more than sufficient to identify the Jesus of Nazareth that we all read about in the New Testament.
You're trying to tell me that they verified the things that are told in the New Testament, but that's because they are things that came from the New Testament. This is not independent verification. This is circular fucking reasoning there, bud.
Each one of these sources speaks of Jesus as a real historical person, as though it were an assumed fact.
Because it was an assumed fact at that time. The Gospels had already been written by the time all of these authors wrote their shit.
However, when the multiple sources are grouped together, they produce an even stronger case. With these 5 sources, we can have confidence in saying that Jesus was considered to be wise, Jesus was revered as the teacher, Jesus was claimed to have performed miraculous acts, Jesus was crucified, Jesus' followers believed he had risen from the dead, and Jesus was worshipped as a god.
Well, yeah. Obviously, all of those would reflect those things because they were writing using Christians or the Gospels, whichever one, as their source. This entire video is nothing but circular logic. I don't understand how this kind of circular logic can really establish anything in history. What it boils down to is that you're doing history in an ass-backwards way. What we want is independent testimony, not people who seem to be independent that are using the one exact same source, being the Gospels or Paul.
So here's the bottom line. The Jesus that we read about in the New Testament was a real historical person that walked the earth in 1st century Palestine.
Most probably not. Definitely not the Gospel version, and what I think is most probably not what Paul thought about Jesus. So no, none of that statement's true at all.
Any who would deny this plain fact is demonstrating an extreme level of historical criticism that would render nearly all ancient history uncertain.
No, actually what we're wanting to do is apply the exact same historical method to the Jesus question as we do to all of the other historical figures. But what we have is the New Testament scholars and Christian apologists who want to use a special version of the historical method in order to prove that Jesus existed in history. So it's not the mythicists who are misusing the historical method. You people are just simply not even using the historical method. You're using apologetics.
I'd like to end this video with a word from Dr. Bart Ehrman. Dr. Ehrman is a graduate of Moody Bible Institute, Wheaton College, and Princeton Theological Seminary. He studied under the late Bruce Metzger and became an expert in New Testament textual criticism. Dr. Ehrman is himself not a Christian and a professed unbeliever and critic of Christianity. Yet Dr. Ehrman himself has gone on record and opposed this very uneducated and uninformed view.
The only one that seems to be uneducated here is you. This is an academic position. There are peer-reviewed academic challenges to the claim that Jesus existed in history. So I feel like you're the one that's uneducated here. And this was released in June of 2016. So Carrier's book had been out for a full 2 years at that point.
So I'll go ahead and let him have the last word.
It is not, I mean, I know in the crowds you all run around with, it's commonly thought that Jesus did not exist. Let me tell you, once you get outside of your conclave, there's nobody who, I mean, this is not even an issue for scholars of antiquity. There is no scholar in any college or university in the Western world who teaches classics, ancient history, New Testament, early Christianity, any related field who doubts that Jesus existed. The reason for thinking Jesus existed is because he is abundantly attested in early sources. I think that atheists have done themselves a disservice by jumping on the bandwagon of mythicism, because frankly it makes you look foolish to the outside world.
And I would, of course, highly disagree with Bart Ehrman. Bart hasn't even honestly interacted with the arguments for mythicism, most notably Richard Carrier's peer-reviewed book, nor Raffaella Taster's newly released book. Given that you haven't actually interacted with the evidence, I don't see how you can make that assumption. But also, you should definitely ask, why is it so grounded in scholarship that Jesus definitely existed? Somebody that's wanting to usher you not to look into something is probably trying to push you away from something you should definitely look into. And I mean, I'm here to help you guys. That's why I have my Crestus app. It's put forward to you in a very clear, concise way about why Jesus probably didn't exist in history. I highly suggest you guys getting it, or going the extra mile and getting Carrier's books as well as Dr. Robert Price's books or David Fitzgerald's books. There are a lot of books on this particular subject, so you can definitely go out there and see for yourself what the evidence is, what the challenge to the evidence is, and then hear the deafening silence from the scholarly community about the challenges to the historical Jesus. Thank you, heathens, for joining me today. I know this might have been a little bit of a long video on the historicity of Jesus, but I'm really kind of going forward with this like full bore on the mythicism stuff here on the channel. So I get it if you don't like it. I do have a mythicist call-in show that I'm going to be hosting every weekend or every other weekend, just depending on how my schedule lines up. So I hope that you heathens will join me later on this week and next week here on the channel. If you will, please go down below. Let me know what your thoughts are on these 5 sources for Jesus. Do you think that it's all circular logic or no? Let me know down below. While you're down there, make sure you smash that like button and subscribe if you like mythicist content in your feed. Don't forget to stand up and use your voice. Bye, heathens.